Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about the classic of poetry, also called the Book of Songs or the Book of Odes. This is one of the most important pieces of ancient Chinese literature. This was a collection of poems that was brought together somewhere between 1000 and 600 BCE during the time of the Zhou Dynasty, which is one of the sort of most important, influential early dynasties of Chinese history. And the classic of poetry brings together a lot of different poems about a lot of different subjects dealing with social issues, gender relations, agriculture, the meaning of existence, these sort of themes, and it does it in the form of lyric poetry. So that's poems that could be set to music, that are written in verse, lines. This is very, very unique in world cultures. Many ancient cultures developed a robust epic tradition. We think of the Epic of Gilgamesh, Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, the Aeneid. We can think of Beowulf. We can think of Sundiata in West Africa, in Mali. The Ramayana and Mahabharata in Indian culture. Epic poetry tends to be sort of the thing, but in East Asian culture, partially because of the incredibly important influence of the classic of poetry, lyric poetry takes on much more cultural significance. So we see this in Chinese literature, Korean literature, Japanese literature, and so on and so on. Epic poetry is never quite as culturally significant. It's not the cultural touchstone in the way that it is for many other world cultures. Instead, lyric poetry becomes the most influential form. And part of that is because Confucius, the near mythic, near legendary Chinese philosopher who shaped so much of Chinese culture, identified the classic of poetry as one of the most important books that should be studied by Chinese people. So this became incredibly significant throughout Chinese culture and then the other East Asian cultures that were strongly influenced by China. So the classic of poetry, we are going to talk about the classic of poetry itself, some of the poems themselves, but later on, according to the Norton Anthology introduction here, more than half a millennium after the actual compilation of the classic of poetry, there was a piece written called The Great Preface, which sort of orients, contextualizes, and starts explaining what the classic of poetry is all about. And one of the important things that the Great Preface does is it establishes 6 criteria or 6 characteristics of the poems in that collection. So what it says here, thus there are 6 principles in the poem. 1 is airs. So there's 3 of these that are types of poems. So airs would be folk songs, basically. These sort of traditional songs from folk culture, mountain culture, things like this. They tend to be very rooted in nature. They tend to explore interpersonal experience, the meaning of life, etc., etc. So airs is 1. 2 is exposition. That is the describing of situations in detail, giving us clear information. 3 is comparison. So analogies, using a particular set of ideas or images to reflect on another. So we'll see this a lot with some of the poems I'm going to read to you. 4 is affective image. So again, imagery is really important. These are lyric poems. These are generally quite short. and they derive a lot of their power from emotional resonances. And so the poems are using particular types of imagery, again, especially nature imagery, to evoke a reaction in the reader. 5 is odes. These are kind of praise songs to members of the Zhou Dynasty, primarily, to important people. They sort of honor the subject of the poem. And then hymns is number 6. So these are more sort of religious or mythically oriented. And we'll talk about one of those. So the classic of poetry, again, most of these are quite short. As I said, I'm reading this out of the Norton Anthology of World Literature, so they have a very, very small selection of these. But I want to read you a few of them, because I think some of these are really, really interesting. And again, they'll illustrate those ideas of like affective imagery and comparison. So the other thing that we'll see pretty consistently in these is repetition. Repetition with variation to create particular images, conclusions, to have implicit social commentary, cultural commentary, etc., etc. So this one is called Peach Tree Soft and Tender. Peach tree soft and tender, how your blossoms glow. The bride is going to her home. She well befits this house. Peach tree soft and tender, plump the ripening fruit. The bride is going to her home. She well befits this house. Peach tree soft and tender, its leaves spread thick and full. The bride is going to her home. She well befits these folk. So again, we've got this repetition. Many of the lines here, the first and third line of each stanza is exactly the same in each case, and the fourth line of the first and second stanza are exactly the same. We get a slight variation in the fourth line of the third stanza. We go from she well befits this house, which is in the first and second stanza, to she well befits these folk. Same general idea, but slightly different. But the line that really changes is the second line. So this is about the peach tree. The first stanza says, how your blossoms glow. The second says, plump the ripening fruit. The third says, its leaves spread thick and full. This poem is not really about the peach tree. The peach tree is the occasion. The peach tree is the affective image, the thing that people will be able to visualize. But it's a poem about gender roles. It's a poem about the importance of pregnancy, right? When we get the first stanza, how your blossoms glow, this is the new bride, somebody who is, I don't know, glowing. We often say, like, you have an internal glow at moments of joy, marriages, pregnancy, things like this. So we can very easily sort of make that link. How your blossoms glow about the tree is telling us something about the bride. The bride is full of life and enthusiasm and joy. In the second stanza, plump the ripening fruit. Pregnancy, right? Just people physically increase in size when they become pregnant. Pregnancy is often compared to sort of ripening of fruit, so we've got that link. And then in the third stanza, its leaves spread thick and full is the second line. We can read this as this woman has now given birth. She has expanded the family tree, right? She has, because this is one of the things that I think is particularly important. Traditionally in Chinese culture, prior particularly to the one-child law, but traditionally in Chinese culture, having children was very, very important because you have a system of ancestor worship, or at least ancestor reverence. ancestors are very, very important in traditional Chinese culture, Confucianism, etc., etc. And so without having children, you can't become the ancestors of future generations. So having children is incredibly important in a religious sense, or a philosophical sense, if we want to put it that way instead. So again, we get this this juxtaposition of narrative of nature imagery with some kind of social commentary. The peach tree goes through this life cycle of being fertile, having fruit. Its leaves are abundant. The human being, the bride in this case, goes through this cycle of the joy of marriage, pregnancy, expanding the family tree. So we have these kinds of things over and over again, these comparisons between nature imagery and the social situation that's being discussed. The same kind of thing happens in Plums Are Falling, but we move in a slightly different direction. Plums are falling, 7 are the fruits, many men want me, let me have a fine one. Plums are falling, 3 are the fruits, many men want me, let me have a steady one. Plums are falling, catch them in the basket, many men want me, let me be the bride of one. So the comparison here is between plums and suitors, the number of suitors pursuing this woman as she narrows down her choice toward a single one. We move from 7 to 3 to 1 being evoked in the final line of the final stanza. So again, we've got that link between fruit and marriage in this case, and the sort of the gathering of fruit in abundance compared to the singular relationship within marriage. Another one here, Dead Roe Deer. I think this one's really, really, really interesting. Really, really, really good. A roe deer dead in the meadow, all wrapped in white rushes. The maiden's heart was filled with spring, a gentleman led her astray. Undergrowth in forest, dead deer in the meadow, all wound with white rushes, a maiden white as marble. Softly now and gently, gently, do not touch my apron, sir, and don't set the cur to barking. So I think these first two stanzas are really, really interesting. I'm not as sold on the third stanza. I get what it's doing. It's this sort of evocation of like, if we're going to have an affair, it needs to be kept secret. Okay, I'm fine with that. I don't find it super interesting. But these first two stanzas I think are really, really interesting. You've got the juxtaposition of this dead deer in the meadow with the woman who has fallen, in the parlance of traditional Western Christian cultures. This idea that she has lost her virginity, and so she is in some way like this dead deer. This is the comparison. But the first stanza doesn't actually say that. It gives an implicit comparison, right? A roe deer dead in the meadow, all wrapped in white rushes. The maiden's heart was filled with spring, a gentleman led her astray. So we don't have the comparison as such. We don't have a simile or a metaphor, either saying this maiden is like this dead deer, or this maiden is this dead deer. We don't have that. We have a juxtaposition of images. The first two lines about the deer, the second two lines about the maiden. And we are meant to see the comparison. So again, that comparison is still working here. One of those key elements from the great preface, along with those affective images of the dead roe deer wrapped in white reeds. In the second stanza, though, we actually move to a more direct comparison, right? Because the last two lines of that stanza, describing the dead deer, it says, all wound with white rushes, a maiden white as marble. So we've moved beyond the juxtaposition of the first stanza to an alignment of those images. The color white links them in this case. We are now being told explicitly but subtly, these two things are comparable. You should be looking at these two things to understand what's going on here. So I think that's really, really cool. I think the strategy of affective images, comparison, all this stuff, I think is really, really interesting. I do want to talk about the one ode that's included, or the one hymn, rather, that's included in the Norton collection, which is She Bore the Folk. So this is about a guy named Ho Chi, also known as Lord Millet, which is what the poem calls him. He was an ancestor of the Ji clan, which became a ruling dynasty during the Zhou era, and Ho Chi was a culture hero. He is a culture hero for all I know. I don't know how important he is in contemporary China, but culture heroes, for those of you not familiar with this idea, basically they are historic or mythic or semi-mythic figures from antiquity who have brought humanity some sort of important skill or knowledge or something like this. And in this poem, what's recounted is how Lord Millet taught people in northern China to grow millet, which was an important staple crop in the era of the Zhou Dynasty. So that's what's being recorded here. We start with the birth of Lord Millet. His mother, it says she knew the rite and sacrifice. So rite and sacrifice, ritual is really, really important in this poem. It's a theme throughout. Lord Millet's mother performs the proper rituals, so she gives birth pretty straightforwardly, actually. There's not much sort of like, oh, she suffered or anything like this. It's just basically she gives birth. Things are good. It's a comparatively good pregnancy, apparently, because she did the rituals correctly. Initially, she sort of leaves Lord Millet out, and he is sheltered by nature, but then so it says here, he sought to feed his mouth and planted there the great beans. The great beans' leaves were fluttering, the rows of grain were bristling, hemp and barley dense and dark, the melons plump and round. Lord Millet in his farming had a way to help things grow. He rid the land of thick grass, he planted there a glorious growth. It was in squares, it was leafy, it was planted, it grew tall, it came forth, it formed ears, it was hard, it was good. Its tassels bent, it was full. He had in his household there in dye. So Lord Millet basically as a baby is like, hey, I'm hungry. Bring me some beans and millet. And I guess people were like, what? Beans and millet? We don't have that because you haven't invented it yet. And so baby Lord Millet is like, oh damn, that's right. I'm gonna plant these things. And he just grows these amazing vegetables, this amazing produce. And that then gets linked to contemporary farming practice, because the next stanza says, he passed us down these wondrous grains, our black millets of 1 and 2 kernels, millets whose leaves sprout red or white. He spread the whole land with black millet and reaped it and counted the acres. Spread it with millet, sprouted red or white, hefted on shoulders, loaded on backs. He took it home and began this rite. So this culture hero, this initial planting of the millet and beans is then linked to what was going on at the time in the Zhou Dynasty, 10th, 1000 to 600 BCE, whenever it was that this was written. This idea of the way we farm today is based on the actions of this culture hero. And then the last portion of the poem links that experience and contemporary farming practice to rituals. So there are rites linked to harvesting that are attributed to Lord Millet. There are rites linked to sacrifice that again are attributed to Lord Millet. And there are rites linked with both human and divine eating of the harvest in order to sustain themselves, again linked to Lord Millet. So it's a really, really super important poetry collection, one of the most important poetry collections in the world. It's foundational to East Asian literary culture, philosophic culture, etc., etc.